They told Grace Millner to stay back for the third time in 11 minutes before the first Blackhawk ever came into view. By the time all four of them sat down on the Somerset High School football field, the entire town had learned exactly how wrong that instruction had been. Grace was 41 years old, and she had walked with a slow, deliberate, mechanical gait for the last 6 years, ever since a roadside bomb outside Kandahar had taken her left leg below the knee and killed the 2 soldiers walking beside her. She taught 11th grade biology at Somerset High, a position she had held for 4 years, and in all that time, she had never once corrected the assumption, quietly held by nearly everyone in the building, that her titanium prosthetic made her slower, weaker, and less capable than everyone around her. It was easier that way. Corrections invited questions, and questions were a door she preferred to keep closed. "You want to sit this one out, Ms. Millner," Assistant Principal Denise Harmon said, not quite a question, on the gray Tuesday morning when Somerset's ordinary chaos turned into something considerably larger. Harmon was a brisk, efficient woman in her 50s, who ran the building's emergency protocols with the confidence of someone who had never actually needed to use them for anything more serious than a fire drill. "This is going to be an all-hands situation. I need people who can move fast." "I can move fast enough," Grace said evenly, though the leg, on its worst mornings, told a slightly different story than her voice did. "I appreciate the offer," Harmon said, already turning away. "But let's have Coach Whitfield handle the gym setup. No offense, but we can't have anyone slowing down a mass casualty response." Grace let it slide past her the way she let most things slide past her, though something in her jaw tightened. A small, familiar ache that had nothing to do with the leg, and everything to do with 6 years of being quietly, methodically underestimated by people who had never once bothered to ask what she used to do before a piece of pressure plate wire changed the entire shape of her life. What Denise Harmon did not know, because Grace Millner's personnel file contained nothing beyond an honorable discharge and a vague note about a service-connected disability, was that Grace had spent 7 years as a combat medic attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment, and that her call sign, once spoken with a particular reverence across 3 deployments, had been Falcon 6. She had run toward gunfire more times than she could accurately remember, had performed field surgery in the backs of moving vehicles under fire, and had, on one especially brutal night outside Kandahar, kept a 19-year-old private breathing for the 11 minutes it took a medevac to arrive, despite losing part of her own leg in the same explosion that had wounded him. She remembered that night the way she remembered almost nothing else from those years with total, unforgiving clarity. The specific, white-hot pressure wave of the blast. The sound of her own ears ringing louder than the gunfire that followed. And the strange, detached calm that had settled over her even as she registered, somewhere beneath the roar of adrenaline, that her own leg was no longer entirely attached the way it should have been. She remembered applying her own tourniquet with hands that refused to shake, because the private beside her was bleeding worse than she was, and there had been no version of that night where she considered her own injury a priority over his. She remembered the medevac's rotor wash finally washing over both of them, and the specific, disorienting relief of realizing, somewhere in the chaos of being loaded onto a litter, that they had both actually survived it. She had left the Army 4 years later, moved 3 states away from anyone who had known her before, and built a life around the deliberate, careful ordinariness of a high school biology classroom, because ordinary, for a long time, had felt like the only thing she had any right left to want. She had a Ranger tab, worn soft with age, tucked into the back corner of her desk drawer beneath a stack of unused lesson plans, and she had never once shown it to another living soul at Somerset High School, because showing it invited exactly the kind of attention she had spent 6 years carefully, deliberately avoiding. The trouble had started 40 minutes, earlier 12 miles outside town, when a freight train carrying industrial chemicals collided with a stalled tanker truck at a poorly marked rural crossing. the resulting derailment and secondary explosion sending a column of black smoke visible from 3 counties away and injuring dozens of people across a debris field that stretched nearly half a mile. The regional hospital, a small facility with exactly 1 trauma bay built for a town this size, had been overwhelmed within 20 minutes, and county emergency management, scrambling for any large facility with open space and functioning utilities, had designated Somerset High School's gymnasium as an emergency overflow triage site. By the time the first wave of injured began arriving by ambulance, school bus, and in several cases the open beds of pickup trucks driven by neighbors who hadn't waited for official transport, Somerset's gymnasium had transformed into something that bore almost no resemblance to the room where students played dodgeball on rainy days. Cots lined the polished wood floor in uneven rows. The air smelled of chemical smoke and antiseptic and the particular sour tang of fear. Coach Marcus Whitfield, a broad-shouldered man more accustomed to organizing free-throw drills than triage lines, was shouting instructions that nobody, including himself, seemed entirely confident about. A volunteer paramedic, barely out of her certification course, moved between cots with a clipboard, checking boxes for vitals she only half understood how to interpret under this kind of pressure. 2 off-duty nurses from the regional hospital, called in on their day off, worked the far end of the gym with a focus that at least resembled competence, though even they were visibly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of injuries flooding in faster than anyone could properly assess them. Parents who had heard about the derailment on local radio had begun arriving at the school's front doors as well, adding a second, entirely separate layer of chaos to a building never designed to hold this much fear at once. Grace stood near the gymnasium's side entrance, technically assigned to crowd control, watching the chaos unfold with the particular stillness of someone forcibly holding herself back from an instinct that had once been the entire shape of her working life. She noticed things nobody else in the room seemed to be noticing. A firefighter near cot 6, breathing in short, shallow gasps that suggested a collapsed lung rather than simple smoke inhalation. A woman near the far wall clutching her abdomen in a way that meant internal bleeding, not the superficial laceration the volunteer paramedic beside her was treating. A teenage boy, barely conscious, whose gray pallor told Grace, at a glance, that he had perhaps 20 minutes left before his body simply stopped compensating for whatever was happening inside it. That boy on cot 11 needs a chest tube in the next 10 minutes, or he's not going to make it to the hospital, Grace said, approaching Coach Whitfield with a calm urgency that made him blink at her, startled. "We've got paramedics working the line, Ms. Millner," Whitfield said. "I appreciate you paying attention, but let's leave the medical calls to trained people, all right? Can you help me get more cots from the equipment room instead?" Grace's jaw tightened again, harder this time, and for one long moment she genuinely considered walking past him and doing exactly what her training screamed at her to do. But 6 years of careful, deliberate invisibility held. Barely. And she went to get the cots instead, her prosthetic clicking softly against the gymnasium floor with every step, a sound she had once been mocked for and had long since stopped hearing. It was the arrival of the second wave, 40 minutes into the crisis, that changed the entire shape of the afternoon. Word had reached County Dispatch that a detachment from the nearby Army National Guard Armory, called in to help secure the derailment site and manage the evacuation perimeter, had suffered a casualty of their own, a soldier caught in a secondary explosion when an unstable section of the tanker's cargo, industrial explosive precursor chemicals bound for a demolition contractor, detonated during the cleanup effort. The wounded soldier, Staff Sergeant Owen Bellamy, had a jagged fragment of casing lodged deep in his abdomen, dangerously close to his descending aorta, and worse, embedded, alongside it, a live, unstable secondary charge that had failed to fully detonate and could not, according to the base's explosive ordnance disposal officer, be safely removed by anyone without extensive specialized training in exactly this kind of extraction. The guard unit's commanding officer, a colonel with 30 years of service and a healthy respect for exactly how few people alive could safely manage what Bellamy needed, had made a call to the nearest active duty support element within flight range, a Ranger detachment, conducting a joint training exercise less than 60 miles away. And the Ranger detachment's senior medic, upon hearing the specific nature of the wound and the specific location it had happened in, had made an unusual request of his own. "Get me Falcon 6, he'd said over the radio. And when his commanding officer asked who exactly that was, the medic had explained, in the clipped, urgent language of a man who understood exactly how little time they had, that Falcon 6 was the single most skilled trauma medic he had ever served alongside, that she had once talked him through an identical extraction over a radio from 600 miles away during a deployment neither of them talked about anymore, and that intelligence had placed her, as of 18 months ago, living somewhere in this exact county. It took 11 minutes for that detachment to locate Somerset as the nearest large open landing zone with adequate space for a full formation, and another 6 minutes for 4 Black Hawks to lift off from their training exercise and begin the flight that would, within 20 minutes, tear the roof off Somerset High School's carefully organized crisis. Grace felt the vibration in the gymnasium floor before she heard anything at all. A low, resonant thrumming that traveled up through the soles of her boots and settled somewhere behind her sternum, with a familiarity that made every hair on her arms rise at once. She knew that sound. She had spent 7 years of her life either desperately hoping to hear it, or dreading exactly what it meant when it finally arrived. "What in God's name is that?" Coach Whitfield said, glancing toward the gymnasium's high windows as the thrumming grew into something the entire building could feel. "Black Hawks," Grace said quietly, before she could stop herself. 4 of them. Whitfield stared at her for a half-second too long, the particular unhurried certainty in her voice registering as strange before he had time to fully process why. And then the football field beyond the gymnasium's side doors erupted into a violent storm of dust and flattened grass as 4 military helicopters descended in tight formation, close enough together that the combined rotor wash tore the visiting team's banner clean off its posts and sent a row of folding chairs cartwheeling across the turf. The gymnasium's side doors were kicked open moments later, and 6 soldiers in combat gear moved through them at a dead run, carrying a field litter between them, the man on it pale and drenched in sweat, a hastily packed field dressing across his abdomen doing considerably less than anyone wanted it to. "We need Falcon 6, the lead soldier shouted into the chaos of the gymnasium, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the room instantly. "Now. This is not a request." Denise Harmon, arriving at a near sprint from the far side of the gym, stared at the armed men and the wounded soldier with an expression somewhere between terror and administrative panic. "This is a school. We have children being treated in this room. You cannot simply bring weapons and—" "Ma'am, I don't have time for this conversation," the lead soldier said, cutting her off with a sharpness that made her flinch. "I have a critically wounded sergeant with an unstable explosive fragment 2 centimeters from his aorta, and I need the one person on this earth who's done this exact extraction before, so unless you're her, you need to get out of my way." "We don't have anyone here named Falcon 6, Harmon said, her voice climbing. "This is a public school. We have teachers. We have—" "Falcon 6 is a call sign, not a name on your staff roster," the soldier snapped. "Her real name is Grace Millner. Dispatch confirmed she teaches at this school. Where is she?" The gymnasium, already loud with the chaos of an ordinary crisis, went suddenly, completely silent. Dozens of injured people and volunteer responders, turning as one toward the woman standing near the equipment room, a stack of folding cots still balanced in her arms. "That's me," Grace said, and her voice, when it emerged, had already begun to shift into something Denise Harmon had never once heard from her in 4 years of shared faculty meetings. The cots hit the floor. Grace was moving before Harmon could form a coherent response, crossing the gymnasium with a speed that made her prosthetic click rapidly against the polished wood. No longer the careful, deliberate pace everyone at Somerset had spent 4 years assuming was the fastest she could manage. "Ms. Millner, you cannot possibly be involved in whatever this is," Harmon said, hurrying after her. "You need medical training for—" "I have medical training, Denise," Grace said, not slowing down, not looking back. "More than anyone else in this building. I need you to clear me a space near the equipment room and get me every piece of clean linen you can find in under a minute." She reached Sergeant Bellamy's litter and dropped to her knees beside it without hesitation, her hands already peeling back the field dressing to assess the damage beneath. "Status," she said, and the lead soldier, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Wrecker, felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in 20 minutes. "Fragment entry, right lower quadrant, tracking upward toward the descending aorta," Wrecker reported. "EOD confirms the secondary charge lodged alongside it is still live. Impact-sensitive detonator. Unknown stability after the initial blast exposure. We've got maybe 15 minutes before the internal bleeding wins, regardless of what happens with the charge." "Who's your EOD tech?" Grace said, already cutting away the rest of Bellamy's uniform with brutal efficiency. "En route, 6 minutes out." "He doesn't have 6 minutes if that bleed keeps going the way it's going," Grace said, her fingers finding the swollen, rigid tension in Bellamy's abdomen that told her everything the field dressing had been trying to hide. "I need to open him and control that bleed manually, and I need everyone who isn't holding a light or a retractor completely out of this immediate area, because if that charge shifts wrong, I want the smallest possible number of people in the blast radius." Denise Harmon, standing frozen a few feet away, found her voice again, thinner now, uncertain. "Ms. Millner, this is a school gymnasium. You cannot perform surgery here. The liability alone—" "Denise." Grace looked up at her for exactly 1 second, and something in her expression, calm, absolute, entirely unbothered by anything Harmon could possibly say next, made the assistant principal's protest die in her throat. "He dies in this gymnasium in the next 10 minutes if I don't do this. You can write up whatever you need to write up afterward. Right now, either help me or get out of my light." Coach Whitfield, standing nearby, moved before Harmon could respond, grabbing the supplies Grace called for with the desperate, obedient speed of a man who had, in the last 90 seconds, entirely reevaluated everything he thought he understood about the woman he'd told to fetch cots 20 minutes earlier. Grace worked with a speed and precision that silenced the entire gymnasium. Students and injured evacuees and volunteer responders alike, watching in a stunned, collective stillness as she made a swift, decisive incision along Bellamy's abdomen, her hands moving through the procedure with a fluency that belonged to a battlefield surgeon rather than a biology teacher who spent her days grading lab reports. Somewhere behind her, a student who had been treated an hour earlier for smoke inhalation had pulled out his phone, filming with the particular disbelieving fascination of someone certain nobody would believe him afterward without proof. "Retractor," she said, and Sergeant Wrecker, kneeling opposite her, positioned it exactly where she needed, without being told twice. "Suction." "Coming up on the aorta," Grace murmured, her fingers navigating by feel through the pooling blood, her focus narrowing into the particular cold, absolute clarity that had once been the defining feature of her entire working life. "There it is. I've got the bleeder." She clamped the torn vessel with a precision that made the paramedic finally arriving from the far side of the gymnasium stop dead in the doorway, staring. "Bleeding's controlled," Grace said. Now for the actual problem. The actual problem sat 2 centimeters from where her fingers had just worked, a jagged, blackened fragment of casing embedded deep in soft tissue, and beside it, barely visible, the dull metallic gleam of the secondary charge that had turned a routine field wound into something considerably more dangerous. "EOD's 3 minutes out," Wrecker said, his voice tight. "He doesn't have 3 minutes before I need to close that vessel permanently or he starts bleeding again," Grace said. "I need to move this fragment far enough to suture safely without disturbing the charge next to it. That means I need absolutely still hands and absolutely no distractions for the next 90 seconds. The gymnasium held its breath. Grace's hands, steady despite the sweat now beading on her forehead, worked with a delicate, terrifying slowness, easing the jagged fragment a fraction of an inch at a time, her eyes never leaving the narrow, blood-slick space where a single wrong movement would end considerably more than one life in this room. The EOD technician arrived at 91 seconds, breathless, in full protective gear, and took one look at the field, the open incision, the fragment held in careful stasis, and the calm, focused woman managing all of it with her bare hands, before saying, with genuine awe in his voice, "Ma'am, I've done this exact extraction in a bunker with 6 feet of concrete between me and everyone else. You're doing it in a school gym with 300 witnesses." "I didn't have a choice about the venue," Grace said, not looking up. "Just get the charge out clean. I'll handle the rest." "Copy that," the technician said, kneeling opposite her, his gloved hands moving with a slow, practiced deliberation that matched her own, despite the very different training that had brought each of them to this exact moment. "On my count, I'm going to lift and rotate 2 degrees to clear the fragment's edge. You hold everything else exactly where it is. Nobody in this room breathes loud for the next 30 seconds. The gymnasium, already holding its breath in the particular way 300 frightened people hold their breath together, seemed to press itself even further into silence, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights and the technician's low, steady countdown. Grace's hands did not move, did not tremble, held their position with the exact stillness of a woman who had once done considerably more dangerous work than this, with considerably less light to see by. Working in careful, coordinated silence, the technician extracted the unstable device with a slow, deliberate precision that stretched 4 more excruciating minutes into what felt, to everyone watching, like considerably longer, and when he finally sealed it into a containment case and stepped back, exhaling hard enough that his entire visor fogged, the gymnasium erupted into a ragged, disbelieving cheer that Grace barely registered, already moving on to close the vessel and pack the remaining wound with the same unhurried focus she'd carried through the entire ordeal. "Bleeding's controlled, vessels sutured. He needs a real operating room for the rest of this, but he's going to make it," she said finally, stripping off gloves that had gone entirely red, her hands, steady through the last 20 minutes, finally beginning to tremble now that there was nothing left requiring them to be steady. Staff Sergeant Wrecker looked at her for a long moment, something in his weathered face shifting into an expression that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with 6 years of wondering whether the medic who'd once talked him through the worst night of his career had survived her own injuries at all. "Falcon 6, he said quietly. "We heard you got hit outside Kandahar. Lost part of your leg. We didn't know if you made it." "I made it," Grace said, glancing down at the prosthetic that had spent 4 years being treated at Somerset High School as evidence of exactly how little she could be trusted to do. "Slower than I used to be. Apparently that's still fast enough." Wrecker straightened, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. And behind him, the remaining soldiers who had gathered near the gymnasium's side doors followed in perfect, silent unison, their boots striking the polished floor with a sound that carried clearly through a room that had, 20 minutes earlier, been organized chaos and was now something closer to reverent stillness. Denise Harmon, standing at the edge of the crowd with an expression of profound, unraveling disbelief, found herself, for the first time in 4 years of quietly underestimating Grace Millner, entirely without words. She thought back unwillingly to every small moment over the past 4 years where she had made a decision on Grace's behalf without asking. Every meeting where she'd assigned her the easier task, the quieter corner, the job that wouldn't require moving quickly, and the weight of all of it settled over her at once, heavier than she expected it to be. "I owe you an apology," she said finally, once the medevac crew had loaded Sergeant Bellamy for transport, and the gymnasium had begun, slowly, to reassemble itself into something resembling order. "I told you to stay back. I told you that 3 separate times today." "You did," Grace agreed, without heat, watching the litter disappear through the side doors. "You weren't entirely wrong to worry about the leg, Denise. It does slow me down some days. It just turns out there are things it doesn't slow down nearly as much as everyone around here assumed." Harmon was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the soldiers file out through the gymnasium's side doors, the dust from the rotor wash still settling on the football field beyond. "How long were you planning on letting all of us believe you were exactly what we assumed you were?" "Indefinitely, if I'd had any say in it," Grace said. And there was no bitterness in it, only a tired, honest weariness. "It's simpler that way. Nobody asks questions. Nobody needs anything from you that you're not sure you can give anymore." "I'm sorry," Harmon said again, and this time it carried more weight than the first apology had. "For what it's worth, I don't think anyone in this building is going to make that particular mistake again." Coach Whitfield, still visibly shaken, approached with the particular careful respect of a man reassessing an entire relationship in real time. "The cots," he said. "I had you fetching cots." "The cots needed fetching," Grace said, and something in the dry, quiet humor of it startled a short, surprised laugh out of him despite everything the last hour had held. Sergeant Owen Bellamy survived the surgery at the regional hospital that evening, and 3 weeks later, once he was well enough to sit upright without wincing, he asked his commanding officer for exactly one favor before his unit rotated back to their home station. He wanted to see the biology classroom where, according to every account he'd heard secondhand, the teacher everyone had once told to stay back kept a small, unremarkable trophy in her desk drawer that nobody at Somerset High School had ever noticed. A single worn Ranger tab that she had carried with her, unspoken and unexplained, through 4 years of grading papers and helping careless boys find their locker combinations. He found her there on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and when she looked up to see him standing in her doorway, upright, steady, entirely alive because of hands that a school administrator had once tried to keep out of a gymnasium, neither of them said very much at all. Some debts, they both understood without needing to discuss it, were better carried in silence than in words. "My daughter's starting high school next year," Bellamy said eventually, breaking the quiet. "If we get stationed anywhere near here, I'm going to try to get her into your class." "I teach biology, Sergeant, not tactical medicine," Grace said, a small, genuine smile breaking through the careful reserve she'd worn all afternoon. "I know," Bellamy said, "but I figure whatever else you're teaching them without meaning to, that seems like the kind of thing a kid should learn early." He left an hour later, and Grace sat alone at her desk for a long while afterward, the classroom quiet around her, the Ranger tab in her drawer feeling, for the first time in years, less like a secret and more like something she had simply been waiting for the right moment to stop hiding. Grace Millner kept teaching at Somerset High School after that, her prosthetic still clicking softly against the hallway tile with every step, though nobody in the building ever again mistook that sound for slowness. And if a fire drill occasionally ran a little more smoothly than it used to, with a calm, unhurried voice at the front of the line making certain nobody panicked, none of her students ever quite understood why, and Grace never once felt the need to explain it. Denise Harmon, for her part, never again told Grace to stay back from anything, and on the rare occasions the school's emergency protocols required a decision under pressure, she found herself, without ever quite admitting it out loud, glancing first toward the quiet biology teacher in the back of the room before anyone else. If Grace's quiet resilience and the debt a wounded soldier carried across state lines to repay moved you today, hit that like button and share her story with someone who needs a reminder that the people we underestimate most are often carrying the heaviest, most extraordinary histories. Subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories of hidden strength and the soldiers who never stop looking for the ones who saved them. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were standing in that gymnasium the day the Blackhawks landed?